June 25th, 1992. In Seattle, a white van drops off two men in front of a bank. They were wearing masks. One of them had a bag in one hand and a gun in the other. Their intentions were clearly visible. But before this, they hadn't even committed any petty thefts. Because of this, they were about to make some very big mistakes in this bank robbery. Suddenly, a car arrives there, and an elderly man from the car goes inside the bank. The robbers also entered the bank right behind him. One of the robbers boldly tells everyone, "This is a bank robbery, so stay quiet or I'll shoot you all." But the other robber was trembling with fear. That's why he just stood there by the door. The first robber starts looting money from the counter, and after filling his bag with cash, he immediately says to the other robber, "Mark, did you get the key or not?" The robber used the other robber's real name, and that was a huge mistake. Mark also asks the same elderly man for the key, the one they had followed into the bank, because the third robber was waiting for them in a van far from the bank. That's why the robbers take the elderly man's car and set off for the predetermined location of the van. But when they reached that location, they heard police sirens and there was no sign of the van. But the robbers also had a backup plan. That's why they leave the car there and start running away. They escaped through a nearby golf course, and luckily, their van was parked at another spot, but they had forgotten to change its license plate. Meaning, if anyone had inquired about the van, they could have easily found the robber's address. The whole scene looked less like a bank robbery and more like a comedy show. But this very comedy show ended up getting the robbers $20,000. But the story only begins here, because this bank robbery was just a trailer, which was about to turn into a much bigger thriller movie. Scott Scurlock, who was a chemistry student, was very intelligent in his studies, but fed up with the hustle and bustle of city life, he dropped out of school and started spending all his time in this treehouse. Here, he did find peace of mind, but peace alone wasn't enough. He also needed money to live his life. For this reason, he used his knowledge of chemistry to manufacture narcotic drugs right in this treehouse, and then sold those drugs to a man named Captain Pat, who in return would give Scott $2 million. Living a luxurious life in the middle of a dense jungle in the treehouse and earning a good amount of money by selling drugs. No worries, no concerns about the future. His life seemed to be going just like a dream. But the drug business was no child's play, and Scott realized this when one day he got the news that someone had shot Captain Pat. He was in shock after hearing this news, because making money by selling drugs was his business, and Captain Pat was also a part of his life. And after Captain Pat's death, he needed a new way to earn money. But around that time, Scott watched a movie that was about to take his life in a completely different direction, Point Break. In this movie, thieves disguised themselves to rob banks, and because of the explosive action and thrill of the bank robberies, Scott became obsessed with this film. And from here, his journey into bank robbery began. Scott learned from all the mistakes he made during the first robbery so that he wouldn't repeat them in the second one. That's why this time they decided to move forward with a complete plan. First, they had to find a bank where it would take the police a long time to arrive. Then, every day, they would wait for the van that delivered money to the bank, because that's when the most money is deposited in the bank. Besides this, he would spend all his time listening to police conversations on a radio scanner, since the radio scanner could pick up nearby frequencies. So whenever the police talked to each other on their walkie-talkies, the thieves could hear everything. They would gather all the information about where and when the police were patrolling. Scott started researching everything about robbing the bank for months. On top of that, whatever the police thought about Scott, he would always try to do the opposite. That's why Scott went back to rob the same bank he had robbed just 6 weeks earlier. And on August 14th, 1992, he went to carry out his second bank robbery. The most important part of robbing any bank is the first 15 seconds, when no one has any idea what's going on. Besides, in 1992, most people had landline phones. So until the robbers left the bank, it was very difficult to call the police. On top of that, Scott carried out everything with such confidence that everyone in the bank was compelled to obey him. On the other hand, Scott had also involved his friend Steve in this robbery, who sat in a car outside the bank and listened to everything through a radio scanner, so that if anyone tried to call the police, he could warn Scott to escape before the police arrived. This bank robbery was carried out so smoothly that Scott simply walked out of the bank, casually strolling away. Everything went according to plan. But when they counted the money after getting home, they found they had only $8,000. After all that effort and taking such a big risk, they ended up with just $8,000. Even the thieves started to feel that it wasn't worth risking jail time for such a small amount of money. On top of that, most of the bank's money is kept in the vault, and robbing the vault takes time. And in a bank robbery, time was their biggest enemy. On the other hand, when the FBI learned about the bank robbery, they nicknamed Scott Hollywood because of his bold, disguised style of robbing banks. However, the FBI initially underestimated Scott because if someone robs a bank in broad daylight and escapes in an old man's car, it only proves that the thief must be an amateur. Scott was about to be added to the FBI's most wanted list very soon, because after pulling off a few small robberies like this, Scott was planning to make a really big score. All the bank's money was kept inside the vault, but they didn't have complete information on how to rob the vault. So Scott started bribing a bank employee to get all the inside information about the bank. And as soon as he started getting information about the bank, they began planning the heist. Now they had found out exactly what needed to be said to open the bank vault.
Who is the vault teller here?
And that same year, on November 19th, they began executing that big bank robbery. The biggest problem with this type of robbery is time, because in a small robbery, you can quickly steal money from the counter and run away. But here, it takes time just to open the bank vault and get inside, and even after getting in, stealing so much money takes even more time. There was a lot of risk in this because the police could arrive at the bank before the robbery was over. But the reward was also huge. That's why Scott takes help from his friend Mark, the same Mark with whom he had committed his first bank robbery. Scott started collecting the money from the vault while Mark kept an eye on the people outside to make sure no one called the police. Steve was also in the van, listening to everything on the radio scanner and relaying all the information to Scott via walkie-talkie. Everything happened with movie-like coordination, and after robbing the bank, when Scott counted all the money, they realized they had stolen about $250,000. Even after doing 15 to 20 small robberies, you don't get that much money, but they managed to steal it all in just one day. They were overjoyed. But this bank robbery also made the FBI realize that they were not dealing with amateur thieves, but with highly professional bank robbers. And from here, the thieves' bad times began. First of all, with the help of CCTV footage, the FBI circulated Scott's disguised photo throughout the city. On top of that, they put up his wanted posters everywhere, and because of this, people started to recognize Scott. One day, before he could even enter the bank to commit a robbery, someone recognized Scott and immediately called the police. And when Steve heard that call on the radio scanner, he told Scott to run from the bank that very second. If Scott had stayed there to steal the money, the police could have reached the bank by then. It was a very close call, but the FBI didn't stop there. They started installing a special dive bomb in the bank. A dive bomb is a small device that is hidden among stacks of bills, and it detonates with the help of a wireless signal. When it explodes, it sprays permanent color over everything nearby. So any money that was stolen would be ruined. And that's why, many times, even after robbing the money, the dive bomb would explode on the way home, and all their efforts would go to waste. The police even increased patrolling around the banks so that if there was any call about a robbery, the police could reach there as quickly as possible. Even after facing so many obstacles, Scott didn't change his ways and kept committing petty robberies. He actually enjoyed outsmarting the police more than the money he got from bank robberies. And during one bank robbery, just as he had started robbing the bank, someone called the police to report the robbery, and the police immediately set out for the bank. On top of that, there were two routes from the police station to the bank, and police were coming from both directions. That means even if he tried to escape after robbing the bank, the police could catch him midway. Scott had absolutely no time, and Mark was sitting in the cafe across from the bank listening to a radio scanner. But when Scott came out with the money, instead of running away, he very calmly strolled over to the van. He didn't seem worried at all that the police would show up there, and after putting the money in the van, he just lay down inside the van. On the other hand, the police quickly arrived at the scene and began their investigation. They couldn't figure out how the thief had disappeared so quickly. Mark was watching all of this from the cafe. Many times the police even walked right past Scott's van, but they had no idea that the thief they'd been searching for years was lying right next to them. In fact, because of his breathing inside the van, fog started to form on the van's window. But even then, the police didn't notice anything, and after investigating for a few hours, they left the scene. Mark then ordered Scott to escape, and Scott simply drove away in the same van without any trouble. After this incident, the thieves' confidence was sky high, and the police and FBI seemed completely helpless in front of them. But they still hadn't given up, because the FBI was about to set a trap for the thieves, one that no one could prevent them from falling into. In 1995, a movie called Heat was released in which a fierce shootout breaks out between the thieves and the police during a bank robbery, and the thieves lose their lives in that gunfight. This movie completely shook Scott because he had never even considered that there could be a shootout with the police. Just as Scott had realized how dangerous the drug business was after Captain Pat's death, in the same way, he now understood that he could lose his life in a bank robbery too. That's why they decide to rob a bank one last time. His plan was to rob 3 different banks in a single day. This means that after robbing the first bank, they would immediately go to rob the second one. And by the time the police arrived at the first bank to catch the thieves, the robbers would have already started robbing the second bank. And by the time the police reached the second bank, they would begin robbing the third one, making so much money that they would never have to worry about money for the rest of their lives. But this time, the FBI was fully prepared to catch the thieves. You must have definitely seen this video.
This is the use of GPS. If a large amount of cash is found in one place, then the income tax department.
Its signal will go to the station because it will transmit the signal directly to the satellite, and it will reach there.
While all of us thought this was a joke, the FBI had already invented this technology 3 decades ago. The FBI placed a small tracker among the stacks of bills, which would send a signal to a tower, and that signal would reach the police from the tower, showing the location of the money stacks. But Scott found out about this tracker, and his plan to rob 3 banks was completely ruined. But then he gets news that $5 to $6 million are about to arrive at a bank in the city. He had never seen so much money in his life. That's why he decides that instead of robbing 3 different banks, he'll pull off the biggest bank robbery of his life in one go. But here, they couldn't afford even the slightest mistake, because stealing $5 to $6 million would take a lot of time, and if they took too long, the police could show up. So, they had to execute everything perfectly. That's why, to practice for this bank robbery, they decide to carry out a small bank robbery first. This time, Scott wears a black mask so that the police won't find out that Hollywood is committing the robbery. Just like the previous robberies, he quickly robs the bank, grabs a small amount of money, and they rush into the van to escape. Once inside the van, he immediately starts searching for a tracker. And within just a minute, he figured out that the FBI had hidden trackers inside the $20 bills, and they threw those trackers out of the car. The thieves thought they could outsmart the FBI once again, but the FBI had even more surprises ready for them, which the thieves would only discover during their big bank robbery. Because this was going to be the last robbery of their lives. That's why the thieves didn't want to leave any stone unturned in preparing for the robbery. Although they didn't intend to shoot, if the police chased them in a car, they could blow up the police car's engine with a shotgun. Now it was time to execute the plan, and on November 27th, 1996, Scott set out to commit the last robbery of his life. As always, Steve stayed alone in the car while Mark and Scott went inside the bank. But when Scott entered the bank, he saw his own wanted poster displayed right next to him. Mark was also keeping an eye on everyone behind him, making sure no one called the police. According to the plan, Scott tells the bank employee to open the vault, but the bank employee was taking a lot of time to open it. After the vault is finally open, Scott starts stuffing the money into the bag. Everything was going according to plan, but somehow the police find out about the robbery. And Steve hears over the radio scanner that the police have set out towards the bank, and he quickly informs Scott about it. Scott was shocked. How did the police find out about the bank robbery without anyone making a call? But this was the last robbery, so Scott behind. That's why Scott wasn't going to look back either. For this reason, to save time, he even tells the bank employee to put the money in the bag. There was chaos all around, but within just a few minutes, he grabbed all the money and ran out of the bank. No police car had arrived outside the bank yet, but they could already hear the sound of police sirens in the distance. That's why they quickly loaded the money into the van and set off for home. They thought they had narrowly escaped, but then they noticed that the sound of the police sirens was getting louder, and when they looked out of the car, they realized that the police cars were actually right behind them. How did this happen? First, someone in the bank called the police during the robbery, and now, who informed the FBI that the thief was in this very van? Who was it that was giving this information to the FBI? Actually, the FBI already knew that such a situation was going to happen. That's why they had started training a special bank employee. That's why, when Scott tells the bank employee to open the vault, the bank employee dials a secret number before opening it, which sends a signal to the police that a robbery is taking place in the bank. In addition, while putting the money into the bag, the same bank employee secretly slipped in some $20 bills that had trackers in them. Because of this, the robbers' entire plan backfired. But they were lucky that although the FBI's trackers could tell that the robbers were nearby, they couldn't determine exactly which vehicle they were in. Because of this, Mark and Steve started searching for the tracker in the van. But they had stolen so much money that they just couldn't find the tracker among all the bundles of cash. The FBI slowly started approaching the white van. There were only a few meters left between them and the robbers. But just then, they find the tracker and immediately throw it out of the van. And when the FBI found the tracker lying on the road, they thought all their planning had gone to waste and the robbers had slipped through their fingers again. But the signals were still coming in. How was this possible? You see, the bank employee had actually put 2 trackers in the bag, so the second tracker was still inside the van. First, it was dark inside the van, then there were stacks of cash everywhere. And on top of that, the fear of the police. These 3 things made the situation go from bad to worse. Meanwhile, in the FBI car, the sound from the tracker was getting louder, and when they turned off their car's lights, they realized that the signal was coming from the white van. That's when they noticed that the lights inside the van were moving back and forth. They understood that the thieves were searching for the tracker inside the van. The FBI was silently following behind the van. But just then, the van stops and the police opened the door and aimed their guns at the van. Meanwhile, Scott pulled out a shotgun and was getting ready to blow up the police car's engine. But as soon as Scott aims at the police car, the police opened fire on the thieves. Seeing how serious the situation had become, Scott quickly got back into the van. He tries to escape from there by getting into the van. But in the process, Mark gets shot, and when Steve tries to lift Mark, he realizes that he too has been shot in one hand. And after going a little further, Scott stops the van again. But this time, Scott gets out of the van and runs into the nearby forest. But the police quickly arrive there, catch Mark and Steve, and send them straight to the hospital. And the rest of the police officers go into the forest to search for Scott. Even after searching for several hours, when Scott is not found, the FBI realizes that Scott has slipped through their hands once again. That's why the FBI started investigating Steve right there in the hospital. And after almost 2 hours of investigation, Steve begins to reveal everything. Now the FBI also found out that the person they called Hollywood was actually named Scott Scurlock. On top of that, the police had obtained Scott's real photograph. That's why they started searching for Scott throughout the entire city. Scott's photo was circulated everywhere, every house, on the news, in the papers, everywhere. And just a few days later, the police receive a call from a man who says that a suspicious person has been living for many days in a camper van behind his house. The police realized that it was indeed Scott, so they immediately surrounded the camper van and ordered Scott to come out. But just then, they heard the sound of a gunshot. The police quickly threw tear gas into the van and fired shots to scare Scott. The police had no idea what was happening inside because Scott wasn't responding at all. And even after 2 hours, when there was still no response, the police raided the camper van. But inside, there was no sign of Scott. Even the police started wondering how Scott had disappeared after they had surrounded the camper van from all sides. But when the police looked down, they found Scott's body there with a gunshot wound to his head. This meant that the first shot fired was actually Scott shooting himself. To avoid going to jail, he ended his own life. If you want to watch more videos like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel.